We are pleased today to have two speakers. Dr. Elizabeth Neely, she is the director of the Nebraska State Bar Association, and Robert Moberly, who is the dean of the UNL School of Law. Dean Moberly joined the UNL Law faculty about 15 years ago and has served as the dean since the spring of last year, 2017. His research interests include employee whistleblowing protection and laws of secrecy. Dr. Neely has served as the director of the Nebraska Bar Association since 2014, and prior to that time she worked, among other places, here on campus in the Public Policy Center. Her areas of interest include indigent defense systems and racial and ethnic fairness within the judicial system. Dean Moberly, I'm told you're first up.
All right, thank you very much. How are you? This is the audience response part. You doing all right? Good? Okay, good. Thank you. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how we're going to work today. I'll actually take questions at any point, especially if I seem a little desperate, right? If there's a pause, go ahead and just throw your hand up and let's have a conversation. What we're supposed to talk about today is the future of the legal profession. So the way this will work is I'm going to start talking a little bit about just why I think we need lawyers right now. And what lawyers can do in the world today. And then we'll have a conversation about precisely the future of the legal profession and also the future of legal education. How many of you, by the way, just are interested in law school potentially down the road? Some? All right, I'm going to get that number up by the time we're done. Right, Lindsay? I will do that. Okay. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about, maybe less, unless I get these numbers up, about how to apply to law school and what that process looks like and why this is a really interesting time to think about law school. Okay, so I talk all the time about why I think we need lawyers right now more than ever before. Liz calls it my stump speech. She probably could give it verbatim now. She's heard me give it so many times. But the reason I think that is that I think society right now needs lawyers and people interested in the law. And in fact, I don't think there's any bigger way to make a difference in the world today than having a law degree and using that law degree in all the different ways you can use it. So obviously I'm biased. I'm the dean of a law school, so you need to take everything I say with a grain of salt. But let me tell you a couple of reasons why. First, every policy interest that you have in the world today is going to be resolved in part by people with law degrees. I firmly believe that. Either they're going to be the ones writing the rules that you care about or the laws that you care about, or they're going to be representing clients who are fighting about those rules, or they're going to be resolving the disputes about those rules. Those are all going to be lawyers. So think about hot button issues of today. Any of you care about the environment? This is, again, yeah, some of you might care a little bit about the environment, right? So environmental regulations and the way in which the country deals with its natural resources are going to be resolved by people with law degrees. Those are going to be fought over. We'll need science. We'll need a lot of other professions to help with global warming and with climate change and water and all the things that you might care about. But at the end of the day, the rules are going to be written by people with law degrees. And I know that because we have a great person on our faculty who specializes in agriculture and natural resources law, right? And so he's trying to figure out and think about how the agricultural rules will impact natural resources and how they butt up against the rules related to natural resources and the use of water, right? Or thinking a lot about how Nebraska and Kansas might share the water that comes from the Republican River as a very specific example and what that means, right? Did you know there was a Supreme Court case, went to the Supreme Court in original jurisdiction on a fight between Nebraska and Kansas over that water? And the claim was that Nebraska was using too much of it for its land, and Kansas sued Nebraska, millions of dollar judgment. Who do you think won? Nebraska lost, right? So your taxpayers will help, your tax payments, to the extent you pay taxes, will help deal with that, right? Those issues are going to be resolved by lawyers on the front line. Keystone Pipeline, have you ever heard of that? Right? The pipeline coming from Canada down, the regulations and the whole process of whether that pipeline gets approved or not is being done through the legal system, right, through the State Department. Immigration, DACA, any of you care about immigration? You're the only people in the country who don't care about immigration at this very moment. Is that the case? Please, right? I mean, this is a huge hot button issue, and regardless of what side of the political spectrum you fall on, right, the debate is about what the law says and how we enforce the law of immigration. Right? You've heard recently, I'll just jump right into it, right? President Trump has said that the law does not necessarily protect anyone who is born in the United States. Right? That he says that it actually only protects people who are born in the United States to citizens or permanent residents. And that's not how the law has actually been interpreted by the Supreme Court for decades. But what he's focusing on is language in the 14th Amendment that he is claiming is unclear. Well, you know who's going to solve that? Who's going to resolve that? Lawyers and courts. If you care about immigration, if you want to help new citizens, new people in this country, or you want to try and restrict the number of people who can come here, whatever side of that is on, lawyers are going to be the ones who help resolve those policy issues. Social justice. Anybody know the motto of the state of Nebraska? Equality before the law, right? U.S. Constitution, of course, mandates the equal protection of the laws. We try and live up to what it says in the Declaration that all men are created equal, right? So how does this idea of equality that's at the core of what we think about with the legal system get resolved every day in schools, in universities, at every police stop, at every intersection? How does that work, right? Well, on the front lines of that are lawyers. They're the ones representing people who claim to be treated differently than others. They're the ones who are resolving those disputes, who are defending governments and cities in the way that they're treating people. All of that happens because of lawyers. Prosecution of crimes, right? That's a huge social justice issue. How prosecutors decide which crimes to prosecute and how much to do that? Lawyers. One last one, international trade. Anything think international trade affects you? Yeah, maybe slightly if you have a farm, right? The tariffs between China and the United States related to soy, for example, might really impact people you know or care about. All of that, those trade tariffs, the trade agreements, the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement, and the tariffs that are now in place are being resolved and looked at by lawyers. So that's number one, policy, if you care about it. Number two, is at a more local level, lawyers are there on the best days and the worst days of their clients' lives. So at a very intimate level, where you will get to know real people with real problems, right? You're there, if you're a lawyer, when they adopt a kid, when they start a new business, but you're also there when they get arrested, right? Or when they're in the middle of a divorce. These traumatic or wonderful life experiences that most people will experience some of that at some point in their life, right? They're going to need lawyers by their side. And they can have a real impact on the individual lives of people. If you've ever thought about the death penalty, you ought to read a book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. If you want to see what a lawyer can do to impact real people's lives, this gentleman in Alabama has represented more than 125 people on death row who were either unjustly accused and then gotten them off of death row or got their sentence reversed. 125 real lives, real impact you can have as a lawyer. I think lawyers are really important as economic drivers. So I'll often say that land doesn't get transferred and wills don't get adjusted, businesses don't get started unless there's a lawyer involved. And so when we think about, especially in our rural communities, about how to drive economic development, lawyers actually can have a really beneficial impact on that. We have students in an entrepreneurship clinic that work with new businesses trying to start an idea all the time, right? But if they don't have lawyers tell them about intellectual property protection, to help them protect their ideas, if they don't have a good lawyer who can help them work through what happens if you and your business partner decide to go your separate ways, right? That gets really messy really fast if you don't have lawyers involved. And that's what our students are doing. And then finally, and I think this perhaps might be the most important thing, is that I think law schools and lawyers are needed today because we're specifically trained in how to disagree respectfully. So if there's ever been a time when we've needed people to talk about issues in a rational, reasonable way, right, I think it's today. And that's what we do in law school, and that's what lawyers have to do every day when they resolve disputes. Is people disagree and think very strongly about a lot of issues, but when they're in court or when they're dealing with each other, most of the time, they'll do it in a way that I think is respectful and that tries to understand the other side's point of view, and then talks about it. And that's how problems get solved. Right? They don't get solved by a lot of yelling or 140-character tweets or whatever happens, right? They get solved by people actually being able to exchange ideas. Interesting fact I like to talk about is that Congress, which many people, regardless of what you view of Congress right now, would agree that Congress hasn't done a whole lot in the recent past, right? Whichever side you're on. Right? So in the 1860s, the interesting thing about Congress is that it had about 80% lawyers, or people with law degrees. In the 1960s, that number had dwindled down to about 60% people with law degrees. And in 2015, the number was 40% of people with law degrees. Now, there are people, when I tell that story, they think, that's great, we need less lawyers out there. But I actually think that's really interesting, right? Could it be, perhaps, that we had more people with law degrees who understood what it means to disagree and do it well and actually solve a problem? Could it be that we don't have enough of those people now in Congress? And that might be at least one reason why we're having so much trouble solving problems in Congress today. So I think we need more people with that type of training. I think we need more people in the world who can disagree well, more people who are interested in policy, more people who are interested in helping others. And I firmly believe that what a law degree does and where the future of the legal profession is going is towards a point where the law degree is really a necessary requirement, or at least an important requirement for people who want to have impact on the world, either at an individualized level or a local level or a national, international level, because of those different skills. Now I'm going to turn this over in a second to my colleague who has a PhD, not a law degree, but she's very supportive of lawyers and the legal profession. And so, of course, I don't mean to say that the law degree is the only way, right? But I think it's an important way, and sometimes we don't think about it. It's also a lot easier to get than a PhD. So, Ms. Neely.
Yeah, so one of the things that Dean Moberly and I wanted to talk with you about today is...
Microphone.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Is that better? One of the things we wanted to talk about today is the challenges facing the legal profession and lawyers and the public. But I want to start by saying that the law is constantly evolving, and we now have practice areas that we may not have even considered 20 years ago. The University of Nebraska College of Law has one of the premier space law programs. That's not something that was probably on people's radars 20 years ago. Health law is a growing area. Privacy law, now that we're all connected and have all of this data tracking us through our social media accounts, how and when is that accessible? And so the law is really constantly evolving, and it emerges in new practice areas. One of the trends I wanted to talk to you specifically about is something called the grain of the legal profession. And that is the fact that, like many professions, we have, our legal profession is characterized by this large group of baby boomers, people born between 1940s and 1960s. And so we have a very large number of lawyers that are in that age demographic. And eventually, they're going to retire, and they may create basically a situation where we are kind of creating a demand for lawyers, or supply will run out. But so far that hasn't happened, and the reason that that hasn't happened is that lawyers are not retiring like they used to. 20, 30 years ago, I think it was just very common that people retired at age 65. That's just what people do. Today we have lawyers practicing in their 70s. We have a few lawyers practicing in their 80s. The Nebraska, or the legal profession, is really kind of self-regulating, and so one of the ways that it's tried to respond to this trend is we got to kind of look at our regulation. How do we make sure that these lawyers are still competent to provide services as they age? So one of the rules in Nebraska is if you're a lawyer, you have to do 10 hours of continuing legal education every year. Up until a few years ago, once you turn 70, you were exempt from that, which doesn't really make sense. Once you turn 75, if you're still practicing law, we need to make sure that you're still competent in that practice area and protect the public by ensuring that competency. So the Nebraska Supreme Court changed the rules in Nebraska to say as long as you have an active license, you have to do your continuing legal education. Another growing concern with this growing lawyer population is cognitive decline. It's kind of a sensitive subject, and I think that we all know not every old person has cognitive decline issues. There are young people that experience cognitive decline, but we want to make sure that there are resources in place. If there is a lawyer who shouldn't be practicing because their ability to practice has been impaired, that they have resources to have someone have that difficult conversation with them, get the resources they need, help them transition out of practice. Another issue that we never really talked about even 10 years ago is succession planning. Okay, so 20 years ago when everyone was retiring, you would sell your law practice, you would transition it to an associate, transition it to your partners, those types of arrangements. We now have a situation where we have lawyers practicing in their 70s or 80s where maybe they have a stroke and they're incapacitated, or maybe they die while they're practicing. And so the legal profession has had to respond to kind of create a system that will come in and help transition that law practice. What's going to happen to that lawyer's clients if they pass away and the statute of limitations is running out on somebody's case or something needs to be filed? How do we protect the public from those situations? And so we can see states across the nation kind of tightening up the rules around succession planning, requiring lawyers to name a successor, requiring them to have somebody within their office that's designated to control all the passwords. So we can get in and see what cases are open or closed and those types of information. So there's a lot of things going on in the legal profession today responding to this demographic shift within our profession. And eventually, what it is going to do is create a tremendous opportunity for new lawyers. Lawyers looking to purchase a practice, to get into the practice of law. As that baby boomer generation retires, we're going to really see that transition. Did you have anything to add there?
No, that's
okay.
Right.
One of the other things, I think I'll talk about rural. I'll let you talk about that at the end. So a couple other things that are impacting the legal profession right now are the increased costs of legal services. So it can be very expensive to hire a lawyer. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades is just a dramatic increase in pro se representation. Anyone know what pro se means? Pro se representation, besides your professor? Anyone? It means you're representing yourself. You're self-represented in court. So you go in there and you try and litigate something or represent yourself without the assistance of a lawyer. And this is just wreaking havoc on our justice system. Every time somebody represents themselves pro se, it kind of slows the court process down. The judges aren't able to get through as many cases, and they're in this situation where they want to make sure they're being fair to both parties, but only one party is represented, or in some instances, neither party is represented. And so what we've seen in response is a number of states have issued what are called forms for self-represented litigants or pro se forms that allows people to represent themselves in court better. So if you're filing for a name change, or if you have a landlord-tenant issue, or if you have a simple divorce without children or custody, you can now file that paperwork on your own and try and attempt to do this. Now, I, as the Nebraska State Bar Association director, would never recommend that you represent yourself in court, but I think that's one of the things that we're seeing is that the cost of the profession has created an access issue. If we want to say that we're equitable and fair, that means that everybody, regardless of their ability to pay, should be able to access legal services and access the court in some manner. So another response to this is that we've created a new way to represent people, and it's called limited scope representation. So in the past, if you wanted to hire a lawyer, you were hiring them to take you from point A to point Z in that case. Nebraska was one of the very first states to adopt a rule that allows for limited scope representation, and that means you can now hire a lawyer to do just a piece of something for you. So maybe you decide you want to do this by yourself, and then the next piece is where you want help. You can hire a lawyer to just do A to B, and you'll take B to D, and then hire them again if you want. And I think this is really new for lawyers, and they're just starting to get, I guess, acclimated to this new system. But it's meant to make legal services more accessible to people. And it kind of helps them balance the doing it on yourself or getting advice from a lawyer on a limited scope basis. And it's probably one of the things that I think we'll see growing here in Nebraska. And then I think we are also seeing online legal assistance models. So I'm sure you guys have seen commercials for things like LegalZoom or Avo or some of these companies where people are going outside of the traditional model to try and find legal services. So they're looking to do their own will online. They're looking to do their own LLC by themselves online. And if you talk to practitioners in Nebraska, and I'm sure you've heard this too, the results are not always good. In fact, I hear from a lot of lawyers that say that's what gets me work, is that the LegalZoom screws up somebody's will. It costs them a lot more in the long run because they have to go back and fix what they've done, those types of things. And I think there's a lot of debate within the legal community right now because those service providers aren't regulated in the same way that lawyers are regulated. They're not held to the same standard of rules of professional conduct, and it's created kind of a lot of questions. But I think that all of these access issues have led to something more interesting, and that is how lawyers use technology. And so basically,
Dr. Neely, before you say it,
jump in.
On the Avo and the LegalZoom, and when we talk about the future of the legal profession, one of the things I think that's interesting is they may have problems now, but those are not going away.
Right.
The use of technology to provide legal services on a mass scale is not going to go away. And so it's interesting for people at the beginning of their career to think about what are the skills that they will need in order to survive in the profession in the future. And lawyers, you have to pass a bar, you have to get licensed. So it's a self-regulated monopoly. You left off the monopoly part of that, so we control who can come in and out of the profession. And the more we require that you have to have a lawyer for, the more out of reach certain services become. And so if we can use technology to have, and so lawyers were able to make a very good career doing wills, basic level estate, basic representation in divorces and that sort of thing. And to the extent technology or forms make it easy for people to do, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but relatively low skill legal work, that's going to go away, right? That level of legal work is going to go away for most practitioners in the future, I believe. And so that doesn't mean the need for lawyers will go away, but lawyers will have to think about a different type, what they actually bring to that equation. And what they bring is what LegalZoom does is take a form, cut and paste it for 50 states and send it out, right? And for many people, that won't be sufficient. And so lawyers can think creativity, they can use creativity. They actually sit down with people and talk with them and figure out what their problems are in a way that technology usually can't accommodate. So there will be a great future for lawyers, I think, with technology, but technology is causing lawyers to change how they may operate on that kind of base level.
So I think that these access issues have actually are now forcing lawyers to use technology in a way that they may not have before. And the result for the public is that it makes things more affordable. So lawyers can now use technology to automate their forms process, to automate client intake, to become more efficient and save their clients money. And so what we're seeing a lot is kind of this infusion of technology in the practice of law. And it's become so important, and actually Dean Moberly does a really great electronic evidence CLE that talks about how all this new technology plays out in the court system, but also in law practices. Nebraska passed a rule that lawyers now have an ethical duty to be competent in technology. So they can't get away with saying, well, I don't know how email works, or I don't, all of those types of things. And all these access issues have really pushed lawyers to become more efficient and adopt models that will save their clients money.
When we're talking about the technology and the practice of law, right? It's not just in the practice, but lawyers are having to understand technology in order to resolve legal disputes.
Yep.
There's nothing more funny in my view than reading a Supreme Court case about technology when it's very clear the justices have no idea what that technology actually does. It's like watching Congress have a hearing with Mark Zuckerberg and trying to talk with him about social media, right? It's just insane. None of those people knew what they were talking about, and their aides are like passing them notes. Ask about this. This is what it means to like something, or whatever. Lawyers have to understand technology in order to resolve legal disputes. When the police put a mobile GPS on the bottom of a car in order to trace and watch where somebody goes for weeks at a time, what exactly does that mean for our search and seizure rules? Those types of issues, I think, are really when the police want to get a wiretap, when they want to get into somebody's iPhone. What exactly will that mean for the legal rules that we normally have for phone calls and for books and those types of things? And if they don't have a working knowledge of the intricacies of technology, they're not going to be able to take those types of cases. So it's not just in their practice, it's actually in how the substantive law is impacted by the technology we're using.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe transition to legal education then?
Sure. So all of these are presenting challenges to legal education. And actually, we should talk more broadly about the time that we're in right now where change is so rapid and so fast. In 2007, there were 9,000 Blockbuster stores and 0 iPhones, right? So within a decade, we have seen the world change. You even know what a Blockbuster store is, right? You do know this, right?
Yeah.
So the world has changed. The faster, Thomas Friedman, the New York Times, writes about the change curve has now gone beyond kind of human ability to adapt to it in a regular way. It's just too fast. It's accelerated that fast. So how do lawyers and the legal education deal with that? And it's a really interesting question because if there's two professions out there that are that hate change, right, more than lawyers and academics, I'd like you to tell me about them. I don't think that's the case. And when you combine them in legal education, we really are at a place where legal education was the same for 100 years, essentially, right? And now we're having to rethink not only how we do things in order to put technology more into how we kind of deliver our educational program, but also what it is that we have to train students to do. And then lawyers are having to, on the fly, figure this out when they had that very traditional legal education. So the good news is what the traditional legal education is and what we still do today is train people how to think. Right? We're not educating them so that they memorize a bunch of rules. Otherwise, we could just put it in a computer program. Right? What we're trying to do is teach people rigorous analytical skills and legal reasoning in order to solve problems. That's the core of what a legal education does, and that won't change. But now we're solving much different problems than we've ever had to solve. So right now we're trying to grapple with how do we teach technology? Right? Because any specific type of technology that we teach in legal education by the time you graduate 3 years later will most likely be obsolete. So what does that mean in terms of our classes? How do we teach people the technology they'll need when they practice law? Same problems, right? So we're grappling with that right now. I think there's been in legal education a revolution in terms of teaching legal skills. It used to be, the joke was, law schools taught you how to think like a lawyer, but you never knew how to actually be a lawyer until you went out and practice. And what would happen in practice, we hoped, was that the senior partner would let you tag along and carry their briefcase for a couple of years while you watched. Do you know any clients who are willing to pay for that in this day and age, right?
Anymore.
Clients won't pay for that anymore. And so there's been more pressure on law schools to graduate people who are more practice ready. And we've responded to that through clinical programs. So have you heard of medical residency, right? After you graduate from medical school, you actually go in and start operating, but you have somebody watching over you. Well, in our third year of legal education, you can represent real clients. So we have that entrepreneurship clinic I mentioned. We have a civil clinic that's essentially a poverty clinic, and it's small claims and divorce. We have a clinic where third-year students represent children who are removed from homes because of allegations of abuse or neglect. We have a prosecution clinic. So our third-year students are in the city-county building prosecuting misdemeanors and some felonies. real cases. We have an immigration clinic where they're representing people in front of the immigration court in Omaha. So by getting that type of on-the-ground skills training, we think we're preparing people better than we were 20 years ago to actually start practicing law right away. And those clinical programs are all with professors who supervise everything they do. You know, it's kind of like having a safety net, but you get to try out some things. We also have a program at Nebraska on professional skills. So those are very practical skills. How do you write a brief? How do you write a complaint? How do you interview a client? There's all sorts of professional skills that you have to learn and develop in the course of being a lawyer. And I mentioned some of them already: creativity, empathy, seeing the world through the eyes of someone else. The best way that lawyers learn how to disagree respectfully is by trying to figure out how the other side's perspective, which is a really valuable skill if you're litigating against them or negotiating with them, right? And those types of skills, leadership skills, we're teaching very intentionally now in law school. They weren't even on the docket 20 years ago for legal education. At Nebraska Law, we are training people to think about themselves as if they're interested in business. Some of our most successful alums are CEOs and entrepreneurs and never wanted to, quote unquote, practice law, but they use their law degree every day in how they solve the problems of their business. So we become much more encouraging for people to go into business with a law degree. So I think those are the types of things, and those are the areas where I see kind of future of legal education is more emphasis on practical skills, professional skills, figuring out technology and its impact, and then also thinking about what we know our graduates do with their law degree that's not necessarily the practice of law, and then intentionally helping them get there. Yeah, that satisfy?
Yeah.
All right. So why don't we pause there? We had a whole section where I was going to tell you how to apply to law school and that sort of thing, but why don't we, are there any questions for us on where you think, on anything we've talked about, the future of the legal profession, legal education generally? Thank you. 7 seconds, by the way. So it normally takes, I wait 10 seconds of pure, utterly painful silence. And right around 7 is when people first start asking questions. And there you go, you hit right at 7. But it's a long 7 seconds, right? I mean, that would make me uncomfortable, and I'm the one standing up here. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. One of the things you talked about, technology, I was curious, has legal education changed at all in research itself, you know, and evidence, research that's being brought in as evidence and expert testimony and all this stuff, it's also changing rapidly, right? So science is changing rapidly. Is there,
Yeah.
has there been any change in legal education in preparing, whether it's lawyers or eventually judges, on that role of determining kind of what's junk science versus good science? Just curious.
So I don't know what the baseline for you is on that change, right? We teach courses on empirical methods, and it's done in conjunction with through our law and psychology program. So we have some law and economics, but we do not do a great job of teaching lawyers to understand kind of the basis of science and how that might work. So I think the short answer is probably no, although there are some things that we do teach about understanding numbers. And we talk about it as a faculty all the time, like is this something that's broad enough now that our graduates need to understand the pros and cons of how different research studies are used. But we don't have a great background in that right now for our students.
Well, a course on, you know, is a good start, because I think a lot of law school programs don't have, you know, there's no official training in any sort of research methods or anything like that.
Yeah.
Hopefully they get it at the undergrad, but that's a long ways off by the time.
Well, and if you think it's funny, if I think it's funny to watch the Supreme Court struggle with technology, watching them struggle with social science research is, you know, for the people who are trained in that area is even more hilarious, right? Sadly, not ha-ha funny, but like, yeah. Good question. Are you all counting in your head right now? That's 10. That was long. What do you want to do?
You want to talk a little bit about preparing for law school, and then we can go into the RLOP, ULOP.
Well, you know, let me start with RLOP. So one of the things you'll have, I forgot we.
Yeah, we handed that out.
Yeah, you had handed that out. There's a map that you have in front of you, and so when we think about the future of the legal profession, one of the things that's interesting is the popular meme out there, right, is that there's too many lawyers. If you talk with your family, you say, I want to go to law school. Unless they're in lawyers themselves, they're like, oh my gosh, there's too many lawyers, right? And what I always respond to that is there's not too many lawyers. Actually, we need more lawyers because we have whole swaths of population that aren't getting represented, right? So we're not distributed well, the lawyers that we do have. And this goes a little bit to kind of access to justice that we talked about before. But this is just one example, is that in Nebraska, there are 93 counties. Right? I don't know exactly which map you have, but around 11 counties in Nebraska have 0 attorneys, and around 19 have 3 or less. And in many of those counties, that includes, I think, a judge and people who are 55 or older. So you have fully a third of the counties in Nebraska that we might say don't have enough lawyers. Now, some of those counties with 0 lawyers don't have very many people either, right? But that's a huge part of the state that doesn't have all of those things I talked about that lawyers do. They don't have. So if they get arrested, right, and they want a lawyer, they often will have to wait for the lawyer to drive several hours to even be able to meet with them before they can have an arraignment, right? If they want to start a business, they often have to drive to one of the bigger cities, Grand Island or Kearney or Scottsbluff, in order to meet with a lawyer to help them do that. They're getting divorced. All of those things are real issues in rural Nebraska. So the Bar Association and the law schools and actually our unicameral as well have kind of developed a whole series of attempts to try and deal with that. So at the law school level, what we do is we've partnered with Wayne State and Chadron State and UNK, and high school students who are interested in law can go to any of those 3 schools, and if they get accepted into this scholarship program, have free 4-year scholarship to those 4 undergraduates, and they're automatically admitted to the law school if they hit a certain GPA and a certain LSAT score. And you can't be from Omaha or Lincoln area to apply to those programs. So the idea, and then during those 4 years they're undergrad, we actually work, we bring them in for programming at the law school, and we visit those colleges, and we keep them interested and engaged in law school for 4 years. And then they come to law school, we get them externships in rural Nebraska, and the hope is that they'll go back to rural Nebraska because they understand the communities, they understand the benefits of living in a smaller community, and hopefully they'll go back. This has worked successfully at the medical school level. You may have heard of the RHOP program for 20 years, and they get about a 60% return rate. So we're hoping we're in the 2nd year of that program now. After they graduate, well, while they're graduating from law school, the bar sets up all sorts of interviewing in greater Nebraska with firms, smaller firms, brings them, actually any students, and law firms from those areas to one place on one day and do a bunch of interviewing. So they take students out there, have them see it, meet with the law firms, get jobs. And then the unicameral has passed debt relief for some of their law school debt if they practice in a community of, I think it's 15,000 or less population. So the state has recognized this on many different levels, that we need lawyers in those smaller towns and smaller communities. That's one, I guess, trend. Anything you want to add about the rural part of it?
Yep.
What else should we talk about?
So I think the other area where we need more lawyers is in public interest.
Right.
And so if you want to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, well, and the interesting, I guess one of the things I was thinking of is before when we say we need lawyers, like what has happened? Why do we all of a sudden need lawyers? So in legal education, you should know since 2011, the number of students who have applied to law school between 2011 and 2016 went down about 40% nationwide. That is a huge decrease in the amount of people who are going to law school. And the reasons for that you should know, right? So there are 2 reasons primarily. One is that in the early to mid-2000s, the federal government released or did away with all of the restrictions they gave on student loans, and they would give they would subsidize and guarantee student loans up to the cost of tuition for law schools. So law schools could charge whatever they wanted. Students could take out a loan guaranteed by the federal government for the full amount of whatever those law schools wanted, which seemed really great until 2008. Right? And what happened in 2008? Do any of you know? Right? The Great Recession. The bottom falls out of the economy, and all of a sudden people can't start getting jobs, and they start graduating from law school with $150,000 in debt, $175,000, $200,000 from schools that are third and fourth tier schools. So it's tough enough to get a job. And there's only one thing that can pay off that kind of debt, and that's getting a job at a major law firm that pays a lot of money to first-year associates and works them very hard, right? And so those students were sold on taking out that debt because they said, well, you can get a job at a big law firm and pay it off, which was true until you dug a little deeper and found out that only about 17% of the students nationwide got those jobs. So they graduate with a lot of debt, they can't pay it off, and this becomes known as the law school crisis, right? And if you Google, should I go to law school, op-eds and all sorts of things will come up from 2011 and past that say it's not worth the debt. The frustrating thing at a school like Nebraska, of course, is that we never raised our tuition. We have the lowest resident tuition of any school in the top 100. We have the third lowest debt load of any school in the country. And so our students didn't take on that debt at the same levels. And then 90% of our students get real law jobs within 10 months after they graduate. So they got jobs too throughout this entire time, but there was just less students. And we got hit by that too, even though we didn't really have the problems that other places had. The other thing, there's a larger trend. For 40 years, they've surveyed freshmen who come to college and ask them what degrees they might want to get. And medical doctor, the chart goes like that, MBA, post-undergrad degrees, MBA like that, PhD like that, and law degree for 40 years has been on a downward trend. And so there are just less people willing to go to law school, less law school graduates, and then when they do graduate, they have to get big corporate jobs, and so they're less willing to serve in the public interest. So getting around to Liz's point, there's a real need for lawyers in a lot of areas of law to represent people who can't afford it, or to represent unpopular causes, or to represent things in the public interest that don't have a lot of money behind it. And if a student has a ton of debt, they can't do that. Lindsay, Professor Wiley.
So I think a lot of times when people think about being a lawyer, they think about being a litigator. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about alternative careers that some of the students may not be familiar with that you could use your law degree for.
Sure. So we often say law degree you can use really for anything. I mentioned one that I think is underappreciated, and that's just being in the business world, right? So, especially in businesses that are subject to regulatory requirements. So you can think compliance type businesses, insurance, heavily regulated field, banks, financial industry. Those are extremely heavily regulated. And if you look around, even the banks that are owned in Nebraska, oftentimes the people who are CEOs or who run those companies have law degrees because they just understand what that means. So we started actually a minor at the business college here in law and business. So that's one area, right? But of course, there's all sorts of transactional lawyers, people who help businesses start. There are lawyers who go into government and do the policy work that I was talking about, so they don't represent clients, but they write laws, they write regulations, they help government agencies in their mission, right? What else could we think about? That there's all sorts of what other jobs am I missing here?
I think government, politics.
Of course, politics,
Yep.
right? So the thing with a law degree, right, again, the skill that you learn is how to analyze problems and how to solve problems. And so that is used by any organization out there. Would love to have nonprofits, love to have people with law degrees in charge. When I first started as dean, I talked with a lot of businesses, and what they would tell me is, we'll have somebody with an undergrad business degree and someone with a law degree, and we'll put them in our management training program at the same level, which for the law student, the law graduate, is kind of hard to swallow, right? I just put in 3 years, I just spent all this money, and I'm starting in this management program at the same spot as someone who just graduated from the College of Business. And without exception, though, what happens is those law grads, their trajectory is just steeper and faster than the person with the undergrad degree. They just understand how the world works. They understand how a company manages risk, and they can talk about that with the leaders of that company. And so they just progress much faster because they have those extra 3 years of training in that. Nothing wrong with that undergraduate degree. It's just 3 more years of training, right? So they may start at the same spot, but they advance a lot faster.
I think another interesting fact is that the people that are coming to your law school come from a wide variety of backgrounds
right.
And majors, minors. You have music majors, you have drama majors, you have political science majors, and it's not traditionally what you think. You have people in math and science that become lawyers.
Well, one of the theories that there's this 40-year decline is they actually have done a large survey they call Before the JD, and a lot of people in high school want to be lawyers if you ask them, and then they get to college, and I think there's no set path to law school. If you go and say I want to go to medical school, they'll give you the list, right, of the courses you have to take and when you have to take it, and here's the path that's set out. The people who are your professors are often in this program they'll have law degrees, but in other programs they'll have PhDs, and they're not as familiar with what it might take to get a JD as opposed to what it takes in their discipline to succeed. And because there isn't that kind of set path, there's concern among law schools that students just kind of they get to college and they just lose interest. They don't see it in front of them on how to get there easily. So one of the things we're trying to do is develop some very clear pathway programs for students. But we're not going to walk away from the fact that you can have a lot of different degrees and be successful in law school. Mm-hmm. We have engineers, we have accountants, we have musicians, we have scientists, social scientists, psychology, English. The biggest thing is, have you learned how to think about problems, how to do have some analytical rigor in how you work through a problem. And then oftentimes it's really helpful to know how to communicate in writing. Right? And so sometimes some of the engineers and the accountants who haven't had to do that as much, it's a little harder for them, but they actually have really rigorous analytical skills, so they kind of make up for it in that way. But there's no pre-law degree that you need to have.
I think one of the other things that Dean Moberly and I talk about a lot is how important it is for the legal profession to be diverse. We need women, we need people of color, we need immigrants, we need people from other countries. We really, that diversity makes us stronger. The diverse teams make better decisions, right? We are able to look at problems differently. We need a justice system that reflects the people that it serves. And so one of the other priorities, I think, of the Nebraska Bar and the Law College here at UNL is making sure that the opportunity to go to law school is open for everybody, and that we are encouraging people from diverse backgrounds or historically underrepresented from law school to come and become a lawyer and get that law degree. One of the things.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the Bar Association. One of the things, and you can talk to this better, that you do to apply for law school is to take the LSAT, the Law School Admissions Test. And the Bar Association offers a scholarship for a free 50-hour Kaplan prep course. And it covers the cost of the LSAT exam for you. And it's offered to people who want to attend law school in Nebraska, either at the University of Nebraska College of Law or Creighton, that intend to stay in Nebraska. And it's for people who are historically underrepresented in our profession, in our law schools. And if any of you think that might be something of interest, or I can send the link over to Mr. Eskridge, we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to prepare for that exam, get the information they need on how to prepare for that. We also found out that the Khan Academy has just worked with the Law School Admissions Council to develop a free prep course for the LSAT exam. So if you're ever interested in just say, hey, I wonder how I would do on the LSAT, you can actually take a diagnostic test and it'll kind of give you an indicator and you can see where you're at and decide if a prep course would be good for you. We require all of our recipients to send us back their final exam score, and Kaplan provides us with their prep scores. And on average, our scholarship recipients have an 8-point jump in their LSAT exam score. And 8 points for a lot of people is the difference between getting into law school or not. It's the difference between getting scholarships or not. And so it's been a really great investment for us as a state to have this program and have these people come back a few years later as members of our bar.
Okay, I just want to say something on the diversity that I think is really important. So Liz just talked about diversity as being the right thing to do, to have our legal system have people in it that represent a broad range of people. And I want to talk very practically about what it means in legal education and why we have to have it. So when I speak of diversity, I think of it in a lot of different ways. So you can't know how to disagree respectfully and see the world through the eyes of someone else if everyone looks at the world exactly how you look at it, right? Or I guess you could, but it becomes very easy and it's a very short conversation, right? But when people have different backgrounds and different experiences, it gives them different perspectives on problems. So at our law school, we have a constitutional law professor who is far to the right, and we have a constitutional law professor who's to the left. Right? And the fact that we have both of them is really beneficial for our law school. And so we have programs, like 2 weeks ago, we had a program on the future of the Supreme Court and the impact of Justice Kennedy's retirement, and it was during the week of those Justice Kavanaugh hearings. And the two of them had a debate. And it packed we have a 300-person auditorium at the law school. It was packed with all of our students. And it was fantastic because the people on the Federalist Society, so the Federalist Society is a conservative student organization, got to hear our liberal law professor talk about, you know, you all like originalism as a theory for interpreting the Constitution. Here are some real downsides to originalism that no one ever talks about. And you got to see our left-leaning students listen to our conservative professor talk about the role of judges and whether and when judges legislate from the bench too much in his mind versus just interpreting the law and what that means and where he would draw the line. And I know our students, and I got to watch their eyes just get bugged out as they saw this, right? Because it's hugely important for them to see how the other side thinks. Either so they can like make it, well, maybe I'll reassess how I view the world, or then they can be pressed to come up with the counter arguments. Right? Either way, it's beneficial to them. But I think even at a more practical level in the classroom, can you imagine talking about agriculture law with a bunch of students from Omaha and other big cities? Would that have much resonance? Or would you rather have in that classroom, in addition to Omaha and other big cities, people from rural communities who grew up on a farm or who have family members who live in a farming community? That would be a much more robust discussion, I would think. When you talk about immigration, would you rather have a bunch of people whose families have been in this country for generations talk about immigration? Or would you rather have those people and people who are newer to this country and have family members who are newer to this country or know people who want to come to this country? What a different conversation that would be. Right? So that's the importance of diversity when we talk about it. Political spectrum, where you grew up, what your racial, ethnic, gender background is. Those conversations, I think, become much more robust in a law school community when you have a lot of different types of people there. So that's my pitch for diversity. The interesting thing for Nebraska, when you think about diversity that you all might care about as Nebraskans and as also just people interested in the law, is there's a constitutional amendment passed in 2008, right, that prohibits state institutions from taking race and ethnicity and gender and all sorts of things into account in admissions or financial aid. And that has had a real impact on the type of class that we can build. So we work really hard to get people interested in the law school and to come so we can have that diverse class before we ever get to an admissions decision. We're trying to get as many people interested in it as possible. But that's been an interesting, had an impact on what institutions are able to do in this state.
I think we're coming towards the end of our time. Are there any other questions from the group?
I'm going to jump in and ask one. You made reference to public interest law firms, public interest entities. Please spell that out a little clearer for folks. Give some examples, Southern Poverty Law Center, et cetera.
Yeah, so the largest public interest law firm in Nebraska is Legal Aid of Nebraska. They are primarily funded by the federal government with some state and private funding. And they're the first line of defense or first line of service for people that are at 125% of the poverty guidelines in Nebraska. So they are helping people with custody, with divorce, with landlord-tenant, with bankruptcy, with all sorts of issues on a day-to-day basis. Other public interest law firms or that employ lawyers in Nebraska would include Nebraska Appleseed. They've got kind of a section on immigration and refugees. They have a section related to healthcare in Nebraska and policy. They do policy work related to families and children. We have public interest law firms in Nebraska related to animal rights. I think environmental groups. And so I think the definition of public interest can be broad. But it's traditionally meant to serve people who cannot afford the service of a lawyer in the day-to-day stuff or for a specific topic area. Do you have a few other examples?
I think those, I think that it's either to kind of help people who can't afford legal services or broader policy goals that might be met through litigation or advocacy in a way that wouldn't necessarily make a lot of financial sense, right? I mean, the corporate America has a lot of lobbyists who can pay for it, and they have a vested interest in that work. Other things like the environment, there's no Dr. Seuss paying for environmental advocacy, right? And so public interest groups come and do that.
Another one you may have heard of is the Nebraska Innocence Project, right? And their whole mission is to help use DNA evidence to exonerate people in prison and to bring those cases back. Justice for Our Neighbors helps people in Nebraska who have immigration issues or trying to get status, trying to get their family members. I mean, there's a lot of them, varied interests across the state.
And they have a huge impact on the state. So one is on the ballot tomorrow is the referendum about Medicaid, expanding Medicaid in Nebraska. That was done with a lot of public interest advocacy group support. And a lot of them are lawyers. One last thing, if you're interested in public interest work and advocacy and that sort of thing, you need to think carefully about, if you go to law school, how much you spend on it and how much debt you will have when you leave. And the reason is because those jobs don't often pay what the large law firms pay. It's just a fact of life. Those can be affordable jobs if you are able to keep your law school and your undergraduate debt at a reasonable amount. But that's sometimes what people don't think about. They just go to law school, they take out the loans because they're there, and then their job opportunities are really reduced when they graduate because they have this debt load they have to pay off.
I do think our nation and our state have said these are important jobs, we need lawyers to apply for them, and so there is some law student debt forgiveness in place for people who work in the public interest.
That's true now.
Yeah. It may not be true forever. It's true
I'm not
now.
sure that's going to be around in 4 years.
That's fair.
Well, thank you all very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.